Okay, we're right at 12:40, so it's time to get going with the second half of today's Grid Transformation Workshop. I hope everybody had a good lunch, enjoyed the sandwiches here in person, and whatever you had at home, I hope it was good also. It's now my pleasure to introduce Texas RE's President and Chief Executive Officer, Mr. Jim Albright.
Thank you, Matt. Welcome, everybody. Wasn't here at the beginning today, but I was listening in, and it was a great conversation. I want to thank everybody who's here in person, and I want to thank everybody who's online. I know we have a big audience out there, so I appreciate y'all all being here. A lot of familiar faces in the room, some more familiar than others. How are you doing, Mr. Hargis? So it's always good to see y'all here, and I really appreciate you being here. First off, I want to thank Joseph for doing a great job of kind of setting the stage this morning. He kind of talked about why we're here, why we decided to talk about grid transformation. I mean, we talk about it every day, but why we brought this together, why we brought these experts in to talk about these issues and these risks. I think it's a great opportunity. And we're going to continue to kind of stretch our muscles and do things like this, not just us Texas RE staff talking to you about compliance things and preparing you for that, but also talking about these bigger picture issues. I think it's really important we have these discussions. And I really appreciate Mark Lobby from NERC showing up today. We welcomed him here, and he did a great job of talking about the issues and the risks around grid transformation, and then also giving you a perspective on where we started from and where we are today. He also touched a little bit on what's going on the national level to mitigate these risks. So I think that's important to hear from. We work with Mark all the time, but not everybody down here in Texas gets to hear from him. So I thought it was good that we had him here, and thank you, Mark, for being here. And with that, y'all aren't here to listen to me, so I'm going to get into introducing our next keynote speaker, and we kind of changed it up a little bit because he's got a busy schedule, and so we slipped him in front of the next panel, and we appreciate everybody's flexibility on this. But it's my pleasure to introduce PUC Commissioner Jimmy Glotfelty. Jimmy has been appointed by Governor Abbott to be on the PUC Commissioner in 2021. And as part of that role, he also serves on our Texas RE board, which we get to work with Commissioner Glotfelty often, and we really appreciate his keen insight to reliability. And as I kind of go through his background, you'll kind of understand why he has that keen insight and why he's an advocate for reliability. And we really appreciate him being on our board. Jimmy's public sector experience includes serving as a senior policy advisor for U.S. Secretary of Energy Spencer Abraham. He was the energy policy director for Texas Governor George W. Bush, and he was a legislative director for Sam Johnson. He founded and led the Office of Electricity at the U.S. Department of Energy. He led the Joint U.S.-Canadian Power System Outage Task Force. This task force conducted the investigation into the 2003 blackout, which was the precursor to how we got started in this world of mandatory reliability standards. He's also served on the White House Task Force for streamlined energy permitting. And in the private sector, Commissioner Glotfelty has held various leadership roles at Calpine, ICF Consulting, and Quanta Services. He was also the founder and executive vice president of Clean Line Energy Services. And now with that experience and background, he's taken on the challenge of leading the PUC in our state through these challenging times and these transformations that we're going through. I know that all that experience and background is going to help him. He's seeing a lot of challenges, and I think he's going to get up here and talk about a lot of them. And I just want to welcome Commissioner Glotfelty up here to talk to you all about what's going on here in Texas and how he sees this transformation of the grid. So, Commissioner Glotfelty.
Thank you, appreciate it. Appreciate y'all being here. I'm glad to be here as well. On maybe our 18th day with excessive heat here in ERCOT and around the United States, It's actually we're probably a little bit behind the times of having all these discussions, but they are definitely on point. As you all know, the operators of the system, those that are working for the companies that are actually out there day to day, I applaud all of y'all for keeping the lights on for those of us that are just mere regulators. This week has been a crazy one. We did have the NARUC meeting here in Austin, and I was on the first panel, which was discussing the 2003 blackout investigation. It was where were you in August of 2003, and it was a good discussion. It was fun to kind of go back down memory lane. I will say, as Jim noted, that one of the primary recommendations was the making of the North American Electric Reliability Council into something that was regulated by FERC and these rules mandatory. I will say that we were not the first ones to suggest that, although we gave the final push to help the Congress say that we really needed to make that happen. It was a discussion that had been going on, and clearly I think we have a system that is much better for it. The folks of, like Mark and all of the folks at NERC, what they do as that trickles down through the regional entities is very, very important, I think, as you know. Far more important than it was prior to 2001 and prior to 2003 when these rules were voluntary. I think holding people's feet to the fire, understanding what penalties are, understanding why we need to do this for the good of the system and for the good of the consumers has been really, really, really good. I was excited to see the discussion items today focus on technologies and inverter-based resources. Obviously, here in Texas, we have a huge growth in this area that we're really just at the tip of the iceberg. These numbers are going to go through the roof, and not only operationally do we need to understand them, but reliably we need to understand how they operate and how they affect other resources and affect the transmission and distribution system. So getting y'all's expertise shared with our market is something that I appreciate a lot. I often criticize ERCOT because, and not the institution, but the structure, because I think they've been pretty insular over the years. Since we're only one state, we only listen to everybody in the state. And we haven't done a great job here of listening to experts outside of the state. So those that have been working in other organized markets, those have been working in other unorganized markets but are facing the same challenges. Those in universities who have PhD students and engineering students that want to do projects, those in our national labs that do work all over the world. These are people that can help educate us and help us make better informed decisions here in this state. And I believe we are beginning to open that door to allowing these technology and academic experts to come in and give us their wisdom. We may not always take it, obviously, but it's really important to hear it. It's really important to see what they've done and to see what's happened in other markets. And like I said, I think ERCOT is beginning to do that as staffing changes, as some focus changes. It's really important to us at the PUC that they do that, and I think they're hearing that. For example, some of the things that, so I wrote three kind of topic issues here. One was storage, one was technology, and one was speed to adapt. So storage, we're kind of in a position, in my opinion, between us and ERCOT on who's responsible for what. This is not any indictment on us or ERCOT. This is a change in the working relationship between us. Prior to the Winter Storm Uri, I think the commission, and for perhaps the 10 years prior, we pushed everything to ERCOT and say, you solve it, and we'll just see if there's anything wrong. I think Senate Bill 3 from 2 years ago change that dynamic, that we are responsible for more, or at least to be a check and a balance to some of the things that ERCOT does. So understanding the market, having our own view on things, perhaps, we obviously have the benefit of the independent market monitor, but we need to be, I actually have said, we're stepbrother and stepsister, but it's actually a little bit more parental now. They implement things that we pass, but we can't be successful without them, and they can't be successful without us. So working together is really important. But as we talk about things like how do we adapt to legislation, markets, and regulations that are changing, perhaps in that order, because I would say that our regulations are slowest to change. Unfortunately, in Texas, our laws are fairly quick to change, and the market is changing quicker than all of us, as we know. So to me, what this means is that we have a process that has been run by the industry, and a structure with committees where they can table things and kick things out until everybody gets comfortable. Let me give you one example. There are many protocol changes that have been in the process or will be in the process that are mandated under state law that would require us to modify transmission planning. Some of these things have been tabled at different committees, even though the law says that we have to implement them. And my view is we have to take that more, the committees at ERCOT, the members at ERCOT on those committees have to take it more seriously and get these things done quickly. So that specific issue, it is how we take into consideration economic transmission. The legislature said you'll do it, and there's a plan that has been tabled. Tabling things, kicking the can down the road, in my opinion, is okay for some things. But when you have an issue that has been under discussion for at least 2 years, it's something that we ought to move forward very quickly and get through the committee process. In fact, it highlights a bigger issue that when we order ERCOT to do something as the Public Utility Commission, and order them to change a protocol, currently they have to change the protocol and then it has to come back, go through their board process, then come back to us for reapproval, which doesn't make sense. We need to make sure that this is seamless and quick in the industry. 2 years, I think, was a pretty quick time to make changes in our industry for a long, long time. I think if you look at the transition from zonal to nodal, it did things pretty slow, but that was probably appropriate in our industry. When we restructured in the mid to late 90s, it was slow because it had to be. But the technologies are happening faster. As you know, the money is flowing easier. The resources are getting smaller and more numerous, which means the risk is less and they can happen quicker, which is, in my view, a wake-up call to us. And that is, on top of all of the reliability issues, how do we make our systems, our regulations, your rules, and ERCOT's market protocols adapt to them? Because I don't think they're slowing down. Now, some people would say they need to adapt to us. Well, I think it's the other way around. I think they are the ones that are the economic drivers of our market. They are the ones who ensure that resources are reliable. They are the ones where capital flows to. So if we change our protocols to accept them or change our rules or our processes, then we will get the most out of these resources going forward. Out of these resources that we don't yet know exactly how much they will do and what their pros and cons are. So I say that with battery storage. I believe in the end, battery storage will do more than we ever expected it to do. But as a regulator, I can't sit here and say, our ERCOT system is going to be 40,000 megawatt storage, and we don't have to worry about different aspects of balancing the system. We don't need to worry about inertia. We don't know that yet. There have been studies. We're a long way from that decision, but make no mistake, these technologies today are not going to be the technologies of tomorrow. They will get better. They will get faster. They will have more data. We will need better dashboards, more types of dashboards to understand what these types of resources are doing. And we're going to need to get deeper into the system. And I say that, what I mean is deeper into the distribution system. Obviously, the bulk electric system is the responsibility in the Energy Policy Act of 2005. That's what has been given to NERC and to the Texas RE. The bulk electric system of 2005 is very different from the bulk electric system in 2023 and 2030. At least I believe that. The more resources that we have that are supply resources and demand resources that are connected at the distribution level, the model's changed. And understanding what that is requires, as I said before, academics. It requires our labs. It requires everybody to bring their true concerns to the table in forums like this where we can air them out. We need to be able to understand this kind of area distribution system operations and those devices that are connected to it before they're all connected to it. Understanding everybody's excited about Tesla, all of these electric vehicles, power walls, whether they're Teslas or somebody else's. And a lot of other people do have them, although Tesla does get the name, kind of like a Xerox machine. But there are a lot of them out there. And understanding how they interact with the grid, this smart grid, the two-way grid, I think we've got a lot to learn and a lot to understand how it affects reliability of the system. You all have discussed or will discuss cybersecurity. Clearly, the issue of cybersecurity on 800 or so generating devices here in Texas or in ERCOT is a far cry from a few million. Smaller generating amounts, but a lot more access points. Ones that may be interconnected even greater than the big ones are. Ones that could have cascading effects that we have never seen the likes of. These are things where we need to be thinking differently, and we need to understand them. I don't have the answers to those, but I'm looking to y'all to solve them as we go forward. Storage is an issue that I think we are on the cusp of really learning a lot about. I think an issue at ERCOT right now that they're dealing with is the state of charge issue. Every other region is dealing with it. I kind of have a very different view of state of charge than I think some people at ERCOT do. I think they want to understand what the state of charge is for every single resource at every single moment of the day. I'm not that kind of manager. I believe that we have ancillary services for a reason. You don't know when a light is going to get turned off, an industrial plant is going to trip, a large power plant is going to trip. So we have over-procured ancillary services for that reason. And understanding state of charge, in my opinion, is not the most important issue facing us for batteries. It's understanding their operational capabilities and knowing that when one battery, when it is fully discharged, that another battery or another ancillary service will come online and pick up where that one left off. So it's obviously a very different type of thinking when it comes to conservative operations, engineering, how people have run this system for 100 years. But we've seen these systems change in other major of our infrastructure systems in banking, we've seen this change dramatically, and they've done it pretty well. Obviously, with cybersecurity issues, with distributed resources, there are other ones out there that we might look to for examples, and we can follow some of their lead on how to be safe as we do this, as this transition happens. Just a couple other things, and then I'm happy to answer a few questions if y'all have them. So I've talked about storage, but I want to talk about it more as a distributed resource. As you all probably know, or I hope you know, the Commission and the industry worked together to create an aggregated distributed energy resource program. And we did it in less than a year. And in fact, it was about 9 months. And we came from a place where we were going to study it to a place where we had a pilot program. And that time frame took about 30 days. And that was because the historical way of studying things and then doing a pilot project means that we're going to delay something by a whole nother year. So what we did was we created a pilot project. It's 80 megawatts, of course, out of a 82,000 megawatt system today of demand, and over 140,000 megawatts of resources, or 130,000 megawatts of resources. 80 megawatts is not a whole lot to fear. We have divided it among the pricing regions so we can understand it. And this type of pilot project is in its first phase. So what do these mean? How do they work together? How do they get certified into ERCOT's SCED system? Is the telemetry working? Are people interested in this? We hear a lot about it, but we don't know in this state what it takes to get them interested in it. Is it more money? Is it, are they interested in supporting the system? Do they just want a more reliable system and therefore they're willing to hook up their storage resource at home? We don't know. But phase one will allow us to begin to know that. And phase two, which will hopefully begin later this year and next year, will expand upon that. Maybe it will be larger resources, more resources, push the envelope a little bit further on what types of resources they can provide, more ancillary services. Can they play in an ancillary service market as well as an energy market? And then ultimately, once we upgrade the EMS system at ERCOT, or once they do, ultimately this could roll into a market product for all consumers who have those types of resources that they could participate in. That's a long way off, and that is a lot of resources. So we have a lot of work to do between now and then. But as you all know, reliability on our system, we look at the largest contingency. As we have more and more of these devices, we shift from the largest contingency to the most contingencies, or those contingencies that are behind, the largest transmission line. So the equation is changing. So we need to adapt with it. We can't stop it, in my opinion. So we have to go with it. We have to ask the right questions as we move forward. The one other thing that I will say about distributions is, and storage, DERs, is as we get deeper into the distribution system, the question becomes, are distribution system operators, the wave of the future? How do they work with the transmission system operator? Is this something that's managed internally within the utility, or does it have to be independent? I don't have the answer, but I think we need to have that discussion sometime, within the next few years to begin hashing that out, because we're going to have a lot of competitors at the distribution level, whether they be consumers at their house or distribution-connected resources, and we have to have answers. So finally, I will say one other thing, and that is I'm a big believer in transmission, big transmission. I think high-voltage direct current lines are a missed opportunity in the United States. I think if we had been working on them 25 years ago, we would have moved into medium voltage transmission and low voltage distribution, all in direct current. And we would have had a system that has a little bit more segmentation, that could be safer, that can move power in more ways that would be better for the consumer or the reliability of the system. But we're starting now. As you all know, interregional transmission it's very hard. I spent 9 years trying to build interregional lines, DC lines, and after 9 years, the money ran out and we built 0. We sold 3 of them. They may happen, but we ended up building 0. So to that end, what I think we need to be doing is we need to be good stewards of our rights of way, and that means higher voltages, or better quantifying what the correct voltage is. Just because we use 345 for the last 40 years or 50 years or 60 years here in ERCOT doesn't mean we have to in the future. If we're going from 35 million people to 55 million people, land is harder to get. Rights of way are harder to get. We may not be able to use towers, as tall as they are. We don't know, but we have to be better stewards of that. And, the need for transmission, in my opinion, is increasing. I think we heard at the EEI meeting, Elon Musk spoke, and, he talked about all of the different areas that our demand is going to increase and that our lives are going to be more dependent upon electricity. So from our electricity fuels to our automobile fuels to obviously our phones and our computers and everything that runs our life, more and more. We're getting away from the internal combustion engine and relying more on that delivery system. So we have to think that that delivery system becomes perhaps the most important system in America. I said the last thing, this kind of goes in with transmission, but I would say that one thing that we have to do here at ERCOT is, here in Texas, and that is we need to think and we need to plan holistically about transmission. We're in the process of trying to change that and think differently. Us, like many other regions, we build transmission when we hit a reliability challenge rather than economic transmission. And sometimes, even when we have economic challenges and we have reliability challenges, those two don't even match up. And I'll give you an example. We've got a handful of plans based upon NERC's and TRE's work on the Odessa event with our IBRs out there. We have obviously a voltage challenge in West Texas, and we have a handful of opportunities to solve it. One transmission planning effort at ERCOT said, well, let's consider a HVDC line along with a handful of AC solutions, but let's look at an HVDC line that can help solve some of the stability problems, excuse me, as well as some of the transfer capability issues. We also have the regional planning group that has talked about putting 6 synchronous condensers in West Texas to solve stability problems. And we're talking about requiring all of the inverter-based resources to do low voltage ride-through and other changes that solve some of the same issues. But we don't look at any of these together. We've looked at all of them individually. And I challenge us, me, ERCOT, you all as the industry, and you all as the reliability folks, to try to drive us to look at these things together. What is the least cost, longest range solution so that we don't have to redo our work in 5 or 10 years? Let's figure out how we build this system for 25 or 50 years additively, where we can add different components, but we know that they're going to be added later, and we plan for them to be added later. So, again, different thinking, hard to do in some of our, the way some of our laws, our rules, and our protocols are set up. But it's my view that we are going to be very late. We are going to increase the likelihood of outages if we don't change as quick as the industry is changing. So That's all I have today. I applaud you all addressing these issues. You all will be one of many conferences, obviously, that will address these. But we will hopefully be back next year and the following year and the following year, addressing some new ones and checking off the ones that we've addressed to make the system more reliable. So thank you all for being here. I appreciate the time to speak. Happy to take questions if you have any. Thank you. You don't need to clap. No questions? None?
You answered them all in your speech.
Okay, good. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Glotfelty. And we'll go ahead and take a little bit shorter break. Let's get back at 1:20, please, for our next panel. Thank you.
He's got professional socks.
I know, and I wear sandals, so, you know.
You can wear socks or sandals.
Hey, everybody, this is your 2-minute warning. We will get going again in 2 minutes. Thank you.
Yeah, we, now it's like flip everybody. We only do it for 30 days. And it's only summer, it's not winterized. But.
What's the effect about fire?
No, we got very lucky. The fire did jump the inches of ice, but not where we were. Oh, yeah, I mean, we're kind of worried though. Something about that real old construction, right? Still standing.
It was still at lake level, so there was a lot of stuff. I don't think they had quite like fresh inch or gold.
Yeah. I wouldn't speed out in parks. I don't crazy. So, the cop maybe, and I'm a powder. I don't know what to do on this, Like I'm used to ice.
We have the same odds. I invite Tim.
I bought one. I bought one.
I didn't buy it either, so yeah.
Same odds.
12 months, same odds, yeah.
Okay, we're right at time, 1:20, so let's get rolling with our third panel of the day, Meeting Inverter-Based Resources Performance Challenges. Panelists are Scott Vaughn from the California Independent System Operator, J.C. Culberson from Electric Power Engineers, Ken Donahue from Owl Electric Reliability Consulting, Joe Arthur from NextEra Energy, and Caitlin Van Zee from Texas RE will be our moderator. Katie, it's all you.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Okay, thank you, everyone, for joining us today. We're going to talk about the challenges facing inverter-based resources. We're going to kind of talk about some of the challenges, what's happening to address those challenges, and then maybe if there's anything else, any unforeseen challenges that haven't been talked about yet within the ERO and industry-wide. So to start off, we've had a number of events recently in Texas, the Odessa event. We've had reports coming out of that. NERC published a report on the Odessa event. And they've given industry experts an opportunity to review IBR performance during those events and identify areas for improvements. We're going to start with Scott, since he's with an ISO. Can you tell us about some performance challenges and opportunities associated with the increased implementation of IBRs?
Sure. So as it's been well noted, there have been a number of events in California, and there's been a number of NERC-WEC reports that have come out. And so as I go to investigate those, or the ISO goes to investigate, we find that the amount of quality data that you can get back and from these events seems to make it a very big challenge to analyze and go back and find out what the actual root causes were. And so these events don't happen very often. And so some of the challenges are we're adding a lot of IBR resources. I think it's between 7,000 and 8,000 megawatts a year in the ISO grid. And so when these events do happen, we see different items and different things in each event because we've added more penetration of IBRs. And then when we go to look at the data, it's data that's maybe not granular enough or time synced. So piecing back together exactly what happened, that's a big challenge. And so opportunities, I would say, we've got a lot of NERC committees now that are forming. A lot of people are looking at the issues. There's a lot of studies that are going on. And I think that we have the opportunities to get ahead of the curve or catch up to the curve, maybe as you would say, to address some of these issues.
Yeah, it seems like when I was looking at the most recent Odessa report, they were saying that, some of the issues that they identified in the first report were fixed, but now there's new issues, right?
Yeah.
So figuring how to address those. Joe, from from being inside of a company, of a registered entity, what's your, what do you see with challenges and opportunities for your generation fleet?
So the challenges for the existing fleet is making sure that we're living up to the design standards that they were built against, working to correct any issues that might be underperforming against the LVRT, frequency ride-through, any of those requirements, making sure that we're delivering on our commitments to our interconnect and thus general regulatory requirements. So that's a big one on the the existing operating fleet, which is what I manage day to day. And then we also organizationally are looking at, okay, how do we make sure that the new standards that are under development are integrated with the technical capabilities that are currently available and what they're going to be able to do from the original equipment manufacturing perspective, which we serve as a developer, integrator, and operator. So we have interactions at various points of the project development to make sure that we are getting the most out of our suppliers and partners to continue to support the reliable operation of the grid as we continue to expand a large quantity of inverter-based resources on the system.
And how about, I know y'all have multiple clients and they maybe all look different. So JC, can you talk about some of the things maybe you pointed out to your clients?
Sure. So, serving as the resident dumbest guy on the panel, I'm going to keep everything at a high level. So, one of the things that I would like to talk about with respect to this is during the Odessa event, we found that when we're contemplating compliance with PRC 24, the actual generator owners didn't have a good enough understanding of the requirements and the standards. So where you had the no-trip zone, they falsely identified everything outside that no-trip zone as a must-trip zone. Now, I say that to say this: don't skimp on your compliance efforts, because that would have saved that resource from tripping offline when it didn't need to. So what I impart upon my clients is make sure you have the right people in place that understand the requirements and how to implement those requirements effectively, so that you don't experience an issue like we saw in the Odessa event.
And how about you, Ken? Do you have anything else to add?
Well, first thing I'd like to clarify, I'm actually a contractor for
Yeah.
the Advanced Power Alliance.
Yep.
Working with them on the reliability issues and trying to give them the reliability feedback. And we do support that 100%. What's kind of interesting on the Odessa events, both 1 and 2, on Odessa 1, only 36 megawatts of wind turbines tripped off. In Odessa 2, none of the wind turbines tripped off. It's kind of interesting. And these were different situations. And that's something I think we've got to look at. Rather than trying to come up with a wholesale bucket of a compliance requirement for everybody, I think we need to look at the individual technologies and the individual pieces rather than as all together, meeting one bucket. I have a lot of concerns. I also have a big concern of a retroactive application, especially back to turbines that have been on the grid since 2008. I admit that IEEE 2800 takes a big step. It was originally written to meet state-of-the-art inverters, not legacy inverters. So we've got to work through how can we handle with the new state-of-the-art inverters and new devices versus legacy devices. Those are completely different. And look at each individual segment rather than looking at them as all in one bucket.
I think that's one of the regulatory challenges, that Commissioner Gaffelti was talking about. You can be too prescriptive sometimes in regulatory language, right? So how do you meet that balance? Because there's a lot of different technology out there. We sort of lump them together as IBRs, but there's a lot. They look really different.
Sure.
So
There's a lot of different OEMs out there making different products. Recognize those OEMs, look at the solutions under each OEM, under each resource type, rather than having one big bucket. Some of it can be done very quickly, we've learned. We think it may be done in a shorter time frame than what's being proposed. Whereas it's going to take a while. And there may be some other options we can look at versus just modifying or quote, repowering the device. There are other options in planning. Planning has a huge, and I think that's what Jimmy was talking about. Let's look at a comprehensive look at this problem rather than a piecemeal hit at it. I agree, I think there needs to be some things done on the modeling side of it. I was one of the first ones when I was working at ERCOT that developed the original wind farms we're using here in ERCOT. Yes, we got to model it right, we can make sure it's working. Yes, we need more data. to analyze the events. How do we do that? How do we store it? It's all going to be those different pieces coming together, but we got to look at it as a whole rather than piecemeal.
Yeah, I think that leads really well into the next question, which is that, each of y'all do something a little bit different in the industry, and we're all a part of the solution, right? And figuring out this long-term solution. So, what do you think your role is? So I'll start back with you, Ken. What do you think your role is in developing this solution long-term?
I want to have a reliability solution, not necessarily a compliance solution. We've got to come up with a reliability solution for each one of these issues. And the problem is all the events that have occurred have had all different times, places, events. Low load, high load, cold weather, hot weather, it's all a mix. That's a huge thing to look at. So that's kind of the piece. And I tend to look at it as a whole rather than individual. And how do all the parts come together? I like Jimmy, I want a total solution that's efficient and cost effective, rather than just hitting compliance pieces.
Well, let me pin you down there a little bit and say then, is there one thing that you're seeing across all of these different events that for you really want to focus on?
No, I think there's going to be a multitude of solutions. Jimmy talked about the synchronous condensers. We're talking about grid forwarding inverter resources. Could be more transmission. Yes, more devices out there. DC, a DC terminal can act like a very large STATCOM device. It is a grid forming terminal. Could that help our situation out and cover a wide area? The problem is, we've got to do it strategically. Again, we've got to look at where's the best place to put it and be the most efficient. That came out in our ERCOT study recently, synchronous condenser. It wasn't all at one location. It was 6 different locations.
So I think, Joe, you talked a little bit about development too of your generation resources. So maybe that's where you can come at answering this question from, your role in this solution.
So as we're developing new technologies, we are looking to see what is the state of the art, what is the industry expecting, what are the capabilities we can get out of the inverter, right? We don't want to have a situation where we're treating a may trip zone as a no trip, right? We tell our vendors we want to have the max capability that your system can technically achieve reliably. And that's both on the new side development and our existing fleet. We are going back and expanding capabilities wherever possible. But as Ken was alluding to, there's limitations on existing infrastructure, just physical design limitations because it was built for a different requirement, and retrofitting that in is just not feasible or practical in some cases. So you find yourself in a situation where do you want to have load or generation capability that's no longer there, or do you want to have generation capability that doesn't have all the reliability enhancements you want, but still leaves you exposed for the rest of the time it would not be operating? And I do think that we need to treat the technologies distinctly. We need to treat the phase of operation distinctly. In current operation, in development, and more medium to long term. A few years out. The product cycles on development for inverters are relatively short. A lot of IBRs are a couple years that they're in service or in a service life before the next generation comes out. We have an opportunity to influence that next generation of products to get a lot of enhancements, but we have to do it in a way that the OEMs can support and meets their realistic timelines because they know their equipment and their capabilities better than almost anyone. And and the other thing is just we should have some rigor around what are we seeing as the actual events and making sure that we're implementing those corrective measures from the events that we're seeing, not aligning issues, like making a broad sweeping inverter-based requirement that applies to wind turbines when the Odessa event affected such a tiny portion of the generating facility. It also took, 1/4 of one of the events was a thermal generating plant, and I didn't see any major reliability changes out of that as well. So why are we focusing in on technologies that were not the primary contributors to these big events when we have, very clear cases that the solar and energy storage, because they're very similar technologies, have the most improvement needed for it, and let's focus on that, where we think the OEMs can provide a lot of updates, especially as they go into their next product lines.
JC, do you have anything to add? Do you want to expand on anything?
No, what I will say is, we deal, because we are a consultant with a lot of different generation operators, generation owners. the amount of IBRs that are coming online now, you see that if an IBR comes online, next week, it's using technology from years past. So as we get into, the newest technology that can be used, that's great. But to echo the concerns, what do we do about the retrofits? What do we do about, those Series 1 WTGs, that are still out there? What do we do about the aging, solar facilities that are out there? How do we bring them up to speed? So I think, to echo the comments that have been made, we need to take that holistic approach to a solution, but use the different buckets, each individual incident to identify what the root causes were and work from that point.
Scott, I wonder if you have a little bit of a different perspective, or if you're.
I have a little bit of a
Yeah,
different perspective.
yeah.
At the ISO, we have a performance-based standard that was put in our large generator interconnection agreement, and that was done in 2019 in response to some of the events that were caused by fires. And so we saw some widespread momentary cessation and tripping of inverter-based. And so for me personally, as a technology, whether it's a battery storage or a Type 4 wind turbine or a PV site, it's an inverter. And I want to see the inverter stay online through a transient event and come back from any fault or any trip as soon as possible. So, and it's the ISO's point to try and make sure that the system stays together. So moving forward, we have, with the increasing penetrations that I mentioned, we're seeing different problems. You have control systems on these facilities that have many different layers, whether it's a PPC and then a battery management system and then all the different units that go in there. So by writing a performance standard, while it's not going to cover every single specific thing, it just says, we need you to stay online, and we need you to do that for reliability.
It sort of allows the flexibility to come up with the solution on the back end, but make sure the performance is there.
Well, and sometimes it gives us, the performance gives us a way to, if someone, and most people comply and want to be helpful right away, but if there's a monetary cost for doing some changes and things like that with our interconnection agreement, there is a little bit of a better incentive for us to get that done. So by doing a performance standard, not necessarily spelling everything with, grid forming, what you're doing for negative sequence current injection or some of those examples, we can just say, hey, let's look at the event, what happened, you didn't meet the performance standard, and we can move from there.
Okay. So, y'all have talked about some of the solutions that are coming up, and we've talked about some of the, you're talking about this performance standard and Cal ISO, other performance standards. You mentioned, no trip zones, PRC 24. So I'll start with you, Joe. What are y'all taking? What actions are you taking if you have any performance gaps? You don't have to admit if you do or not. If you have any performance gaps, what steps are you taking to maybe comply with what's out there, and also to prepare for maybe what's coming down the pipeline?
In the unlikely event that we had a performance gap,
Yeah.
we would apply our high quality standards as we do for any other underperformance issue in our generating fleet. We would make sure that we have the highest quality data available. Goes to Scott's earlier point about making sure that we're meeting data logging and capture requirements, both for sampling rates as well as synchronization, so they could tell what's happening across these sites are large and distributed. Even though they're on one facility, they have multiple pieces of equipment that are interacting. So understanding that interaction is critical, making sure that what the expected performance that came from the original equipment supplier met with their testing and their design requirements. And if it came up short, investigating it, right? You take a look at the plant controller, the PPC, you look at the connections in from the system. Is there a metering issue or some other type of correction that needs to be happening on that level? And also just, did the inverter have the right version of its control firmware? Did it have the correct parameter set to determine that it was operating in the mode intended for that location, right? There are different curves that apply for different environments we operate in, CAISO, in ERCOT, in even the FPL territory that we are the regulated utility for. We have different standards for it, and we need to make sure that we are controlling those settings to make sure that it's properly applied. So all that goes into just doing a detailed root cause analysis, and when we find a gap, we then work to address it directly at the root cause, not by applying a countermeasure that may resolve the issue temporarily, because we want to make sure that it's not just this exact event, but any other future reliability event we're capable of responding to.
Yeah, I think in some of those reports, what you see is it was like, or at least I was reading in the Odessa versus one of the California events, the issue had already been identified on a couple inverters in Cal ISO, and then, the same issue occurred in the ERCOT event. And so how do you sort of take that root cause and maybe look fleet-wide at, other regions, other reliability standards?
So we take a fleet approach for all of our generating
Okay.
assets, right? So I'm part of a central engineering organization, and I have an accountability to make sure that these standards and best practices are applied universally across our fleet. So we look at by technology, and that might be by inverter technology, by battery supplier, by control integration style, and we look to see what all the replication opportunities are. It's a critical step in any root cause investigation, and we treat them with the priority necessary to make sure that those deployments are, replicated out across all the applicable alternate technologies to make sure that we have that. Now, there are some generator operators that don't have as detailed an engineering presence, or maybe they serve as a more of a financial role, and they in contract third-party or other support organizations, and that might be more of a challenge for them to apply more consistently because they have maybe a portfolio they purchase from different suppliers, and they have different needs and different configurations on across their portfolio. So that makes it more difficult for some. But we make sure that we have a pretty rigorous discipline around replication of any findings from a root cause investigation, because that's how we avoid having to do it another time.
Yeah. I think JC looks like he's got stuff to add here, so I'm going to let you jump in too.
Sure. So in the event, as
The unlikely event.
the unlikely event that we do experience an issue, we do something simpler. So what we'll do is an extent of conditions review over all the potentially, impacted IBRs that are out there. And so that's sort of the first step, exactly what you said that you were doing as well. So yeah, that's in addition to the root cause analysis. Once you figure out, what has been done, then applying that across the board at similar, IBR similar stations that could have, the same issue is something that we do.
Do you have anything you would like to add, Ken, since Wynn did so well in the?
Well, again, it's everything in here, but at the same time, I think, just like at your plant, you go look at root cause and are there any common mode failures, I think everybody's doing the same, even the transmission providers, the generators, everybody's doing the same, looking, is there a common mode failure that we can resolve and try to prevent it? I wish you could prevent faults, you can't. Tornado happens, wildfires happen. Actually, wildfires are one of the biggest ones I'm afraid of because it's such a large area that it occurs in. But that's something we've got to think about also, hit all those pieces everywhere, not just one segment of the industry.
Okay, so, we're, again, talking about all the different ways we're trying to address this. If you were in the regulator's shoes, if you were NERC, tell us what more you think we should be doing, what other steps we can take as an ERO. Ken looks like, I know Ken has stuff to say here.
I think the biggest thing is there's a lot of people out there that think they want to be a regulator and want to be compliant. But I think we also need to go to the people who are actually doing it, like Joe and his crew, like the transmission provider. Get real world information. Again, our biggest issue right now is dealing with the OEMs. What is their capability? What can they do? What can they not do? Getting that real world information for each one of those pieces is much more valuable than just chunking out a compliance tool. Because then all we're doing is compliance, not reliability solutions. That's what I want to focus on. I want my lights on. I want my air conditioner running at my house today. That's my concern. So, and that's why I want to focus. Let's go to a reliability solution, not necessarily a compliance solution, because that doesn't mean you're reliable.
Yeah.
And a reliability solution is unlikely to be a one-size-fit-all.
Right.
It's going to be bifurcated, or even, I don't know, the other words for more than cut in two, by technology, by phase of implementation, by region it's operating in, because there might be different needs based on is it in a strong grid or a weak grid, or are there other considerations that might be factored in? And that, I think more resolution, while it makes it more difficult to conveniently apply that you'll be in compliance with this or you'll be in compliance with this, it will go towards what Ken is pushing for, which is a better reliability outcome, which is what we all want. I mean, I want my lights on too. We operate generators. I also want to sell the power. So, you know, if the grid's down, we're not making money, and that's a bad time for us too.
Yeah.
And Scott, I mean, what do you think NERC could do?
Well, I seem to be the odd man out. I like it to be a little bit more prescriptive, to be honest with you, in some of these instances, because the truth of it is they're complex systems, and you know, for like data sampling, I just use that as something I used. We get data in the ISO that's 10 milliseconds. For a cycle, that's one sample per cycle. I can't tell anything from that. So if you give me a prescriptive requirement that tells me I get, you know, 16 samples per cycle, I can do something with that. Everybody has to provide that. I want to be able to go to, whether it's a solar plant, a battery site, a Type 4 wind turbine, and say, great, please give me data in this format, because if there was an event and it affected your facility, there's 10, 15 other facilities I'm getting data from, and try to correlate that all on a certain time frame or anything like that, or the way the data is handed to me is difficult if they're all on reported in different ways. So same thing with, I'm sure for the modeling, I know my planning people, they would love to have, like we had for synchronous generators, you got a Gen RAL model or whatever it is that goes into the system. And so that's where I differ from everyone else on the panel. A little bit more prescriptive would be great.
Yeah, more information. You know, as enforcement, I know people wish it was less prescriptive. And how about you, JC? Yeah.
Well, there is a fine line to walk there between being too prescriptive versus just, here's the outcome we want, you guys figure it out. I kind of lean opposite from Scott. I lean toward this is the desired effect, and then work to get there instead of rolling it out as this is what you all have to do. Here's how you have to do it. That can be fine, provided that you have all the requisite information to make the right decisions, to come to one holistic, very prescriptive standard. And I don't think, in my heart of hearts, that we're there. I think that there's not going to be any way to really be, you know, developing a prescriptive standard or set of requirements that meets everything. I think you're going to get the phone book if we do that.
It's also interesting. We've been through this before. It's kind of interesting. We did originally when it just had gas power plants. Then we got nuclear. Nuclear had very special requirements, and it got worse. Of course it should. Then we went through cogen issues and self-serve load. Then we went through combined cycle power plants. And now we did it with wind. You know, many years ago we started out with it. When it was only 1,000 megawatts, it wasn't very concerning. Well, when we got over 10,000, then you really got concerning with what was going on. The industry, by the way, the transformation is here. It's now. It's going forward, and it's going forward faster than anything before. That's what's amazing. And that's what we got to realize that. And I think performance is a key. Feeding back to real life situations of what's going on. It isn't your father's or grandfather's power system anymore. And these extreme weather events, it's changing, and we've got to focus on performance. It isn't just about reserve margin. It's about how are we performing with the assets we've got on a daily basis. You know, planners used to think we only plan on peak. Not anymore. We got to be looking around the clock, and particularly right now with the solar ramp up and the solar ramp down, that's where our biggest concerns, and our operators, it's gotten very complicated. And the amount of information they've got coming in to make decisions has gotten very complicated. So, but we are in the transformation right now, and we've got to move quicker.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think sometimes it's hard for regulatory bodies to move nimbly, and that's something that the ERO has been trying to work very hard on, being more efficient in how we move forward as these technologies develop. You know, I mean, and I think technology is always going to outpace regulatory a bit. So the question is, you know, can you, as the technology outpaces it, you know, can you get enough data from that technology to make the regulations actually work, you know, meaningful, right? I think that's what Scott's getting at. Yeah.
The other thing is look beyond what is the norm right now. Just think where we were 3 years ago and where we are today here in ERCOT. Look what's going on. Look at the load that is being added to the Texas grid. Look at the economy that we're driving. I want all those sources working together. And we aren't going to get it perfect. But I think we got to think beyond that, not just where we're at. Where are we going? What could happen? Ask the question. And we shouldn't be afraid of that. We may not know the answer, but ask the question.
Yeah, I think sometimes you have almost like mitigating solutions, right, in the interim. And then, hopefully then you have a long-term solution. I mean, sometimes we have to make sacrifices for those mitigating solutions, So I don't know if y'all want to talk about any of those sort of intermediary steps you think that could be taken as we're waiting for longer-term solutions, if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, being the planner of the group, I think one of the things we need to look at is, what is our next upgrade path? I think right now we're doing a lot of Band-Aid approaches rather than going to full surgery, and fixing it forever. And I think that's where Jimmy's talking too. Rather than just Band-Aiding, and here's one of my biggest concerns, we didn't make sure we don't put all of our eggs in one basket. Because then what if somebody takes that basket? I have the same concern about cybersecurity. It scares me. I mean, in my house even, I'm paranoid about stuff, with what's going on. But what's the next upgrade? Do we need to take the big step now to solve the short-term solution, but also solving the longer-term solution? And I don't think we're asking those questions.
Yeah, so I think that leads really nicely into sort of the last question, and I'll start with Joe, since you're right next to me. What do you see as the next step for this continuing integration of IBRs? I mean, this morning on the modeling panel, I think they said, like, as you say, the transformation's here. It's happening. They're coming on at record numbers. So, what do you think are the next steps?
It's at its core a scaling issue, right? I've been with NextEra 10 years. When I started, I had touched every inverter that we operated, every solar inverter, and now I don't even know the name of half the solar sites. And that's one company, but it's representative of the entire industry. It is growing so fast, and the rate is not slowing down. It is getting more aggressive. So we need to make sure that any solutions we have are forward-looking, as in I think the majority of your benefit is going to come not from the stuff that you already have in the ground, the stuff that's going to be in the ground the next 2 years. It's going to be coming from the 10x growth that's going to be happening on almost every system coming in. And a lot of the focus could be spent on what do we get to advance the state of the art and what's being built now or going to be built, so that we have that margin on the very large operating fleet of wind, solar, storage, and that it's got the capability to respond to any event effectively. And where we can make the changes on the operating fleet, we make sure that we apply them smartly and consistently in a way that is managed and controlled, and fully understood that we're making those changes as to the limits of the technical capabilities of the system. And I work energy storage full time these days, and I think that there's a lot of capability that might be able to handle these short duration events if we reserve storage capacity and have the response times necessary to jump in and fill these short-term gaps, even if we have a reliability performance on a wind turbine or on a particular section of the solar fleet or a fossil units going out. Having the capacity to have a quick responding system in that case will go a long way to filling in some of those gaps as well.
So you really liked the commissioner's keynote right before this.
Indeed. I like anything that talks about energy storage.
Yeah. And how about you, Ken?
Yeah, I agree with him 100%. I think there's a different way to do it now. We're going to change what we're doing and thinking about it. And I think energy storage right now, especially with grid-forming inverters, when we have a fault on the system, it's a fairly short time frame. If it's normally cleared, which all the ones were, it's not that long. It's not that much energy to solve the issue out of storage and still be able to operate. But they need to be able to be compensated for that service, which we don't have right now in our current markets. Why aren't we also creating a market for the reliability, for that aspect? We haven't done that yet, but we need to. But I think that's a game changer. And if we strategically place these types of devices around the grid, we won't be having a lot of discussions.
That might be a little bit different in California. Do you?
I think the number one thing that needs to happen is that we need to have predictable models so that we can see when something happens on the system, whether it's in protective relaying, whether it's in planning or events under different dispatch scenarios, that we know what's going to happen. Because I think today when something happens, we're like, wow, what was that? That wasn't necessarily exactly what we thought it was going to be. And so as we keep adding these, it's just going to get more complicated. We see different problems as the system goes in different situations where we have maybe less generation on overnight and then there's a fault. different responses. You've got a lot of things interacting. So for me, getting ahead of the curve or catching up to the curve is first getting accurate models. And it seems that EMT is the way to do that because there's so many different parts of these plants. And so I don't know if there is back to standard way to put these into an EMT model because you have so many different manufacturers that come up with these models. But I think that would be a great first step before we keep moving and keep integrating to handle the next challenges.
Yeah, that came up this morning.
I've got one more concern. People, engineers to do this effort. I'm very concerned about that. Do we have enough people to accomplish all of this? Are we really developing our engineers to do this? I mean, I'm very concerned about that part of it. We're going to have it's gotten a lot more complex. And the only way you add to the complex is either you get better technology and you get more people and models. But yeah, I'm a big supporter of the models that actually reflect what's going on in actual operations. But it's going to be varied.
Yeah.
Different situations are going to have different outcomes of the models.
Yeah, it's a common ground.
Yeah.
Hey,
JC, do you want to add anything to?
Sure. Sort of to segue from Ken's people issue is taking more of a people-centric approach on the regulator side, ensuring that you have not buy-in, but responses, the correct amount of interaction from those industry segments that are going to be most impacted and that are causing, not causing the issues or experiencing the issues the most. The flip side to that is the industry needs to ensure that we are sending the right people to the right drafting teams, NERC meetings. We have to be more engaged in order to find common ground to really to attain the results that we want. It's not going to be driven strictly from the regulator's point of view. It can't be, and it's not going to be driven strictly from the industry. And I believe that's something that NERC has been fostering, and TRE, the whole ERO enterprise for quite some time. And I think it needs to really jump up to that next level now. I think that there has to be more coordination between the industry and the regulators to understand what the real issues are and what are the feasible ways we can, the different measures we can implement in order to get where we need to be.
Yeah, I think engagement's a huge piece of this, and you're right, that has been a focus for both us, and I mean, that's why we're all here today, right? And to get everybody in this room talking and everybody introduced to people that they haven't met before, make those connections so we as an industry can work on the solutions together.
Sure.
So that's the questions we have for you. I don't know if there are any questions from the audience. We can open up the floor. Yes, through Slido. We could give you a microphone, maybe. I'll let Matt speak.
No, we have a few questions, so
Okay.
just a second, we'll get them on screen.
Okay.
Chat amongst yourselves until then. This one might be for Scott.
Okay. So if you're not in Casio currently, are there any recommendations for where to gain access to the reports from Casio events that we could utilize as best practices for the future?
so the reports that come out of NERC and WEC for our events that were done are on the NERC site. And so you'll see them there. There's a new report that will actually be coming out from an event that happened last year that we should be seeing, I'm told, in the next month or two. And then the ones from 2022, there's also, those reports are out. So you can see, I think it's called multiple events from 2022. So there were 3 in rapid succession that happened within a couple months of each other in 2022 that were in those reports. So you can find them there.
Yes, and I went and looked at that last week just to make sure all the reports were there, and they have a pretty good archive on the NERC website.
Yeah.
I think NERC's summary of IBR initiative has a summary of all of them. And you can very quickly go and click on the ones you want to read. It's a very, very nicely done, Mark.
Okay, why not mandate the accurate user-defined models from the developers and OEMs instead of using the generic models? Accuracy is of the utmost importance. Accurate UDM along with benchmarking against PSCAD models will provide adequate accuracy. Excuse me. I don't know who wants to take this one first.
Who's the planner? Who's the planner?
There's
Yeah, I
way
think
too
that's
many.
I've never
okay.
touched them on, I don't know.
I kind of mixed on this. I like a model. The user-defined models are very good if they work. I think that's been an issue in the past. Do they really work? But even generics don't necessarily work either. We've seen, and I think that's why a lot of this has gone to EMT and PSCAD type models more than anything else. One of the problems of building EMT and PSCAD models, once you get fairly large, it's very hard to do any type of analysis. But I kind of agree, we've got to work through that. What is the best model? And yeah, I'm not sure if generics are the best or not. It's kind of a question on that.
Well, we're running into with EMT when, there's, EMT it's very specific.
Yes.
And so there's very few people who are really good
Right.
at running EMT models. And so, we're talking in our interconnection, quite a few facilities with EMT models, and you want to just pick a site and try to run in that location to see if you can get those results. And so I'm not a planner, but I do know that there is a lot of work that goes into doing EMT, and it's a lot of expertise that is not necessarily widespread out there.
Yeah. By the way, it's not a steady state study that you just hit a button. I wish it was. Honestly, I think planning needs to change over more to stability analysis first and EMT analysis first before you get to steady state, honestly. And by the way, many years ago, I did EMTP studies. And it is the geekiest models you can ever have. So it's not just megawatts and megavars.
And I think that begs the question for the smaller registered entities on the NERC side, how do they have the expertise to do this?
Yeah.
The more sophisticated the models get, yeah.
They come to us.
Yeah, yeah, right?
Yeah, and they have to. I mean, if you're a small developer and you're owning your own generators, in many cases, you don't have the expertise on staff to do this, so you have to look elsewhere.
Okay, specifically for
Lucky me.
Sky.
Lucky me. So do you want me to read the question?
I can. I don't know if that's helpful for people, if everyone can see it. But Scott, Cassia saw the first big events involving IBR performance. More reports are coming from recent events. Are we solving earlier noticed issues or finding new ones? Are the owner-operators getting the right talent involved? Or is the ISO stuck with some of the problems?
So there's no yes or no answer here. We have legacy systems that were before we had an enforceable LGIA standard, which is our large generator interconnection, which requires no momentary cessation, reactive current injection. So we're stuck with those. What the limitations of the equipment are, the operator owners have done things to limit the time they go to fault, how they return those sort of items. We are solving different problems. We do see some of the same ones come back and forth once in a while. In the first few events, we saw inaccurate frequency calculations that drop people off. We saw anti-islanding things and loss of synchronization on PLLs that was causing problems. We don't see those too much anymore today. Through our new resource interconnection process, we make sure those kind of things are disabled in the inverters, or they're not going to trip those units. What we see today still sometimes is you see momentary cessations. You see items inside an individual inverter that is a protective, maybe a high voltage DC trip, and how that is set is maybe not as transparent as you would think. And so the operator owners that we've dealt with have been mostly helpful. It does help that we do have an LGIA just in case they're not. And so we are stuck with some problems just for the nature of the equipment that's out there, but not others.
Okay.
I think we have one more. Oh, okay, good. We're a little early, so we have time. Sorry, y'all.
Okay. There are cases that model pass ride through performance requirements in PSCAD studies. However, they do not ride through in real events. What do you do there? I think, Joe, that might be you.
Well, like any problem, you got to find the root cause. There's some reason like Scott was alluding to, is their frequency measurement device not working correctly? Is the voltage measurement device not working? Are you having some configuration in the inverter that's not matching what you modeled? Right, so wherever those differences are, you've got to resolve and correct the version necessary. And other cases, you just have an inverter that's not performing as advertised. You have to work through, what do you have to do to change to enhance that capability? How do you adjust the parameter set for your curves on your voltage ride-through? How do you manage, how it's being dispatched so that there's capability available for responding? There's, it's a case-by-case basis, and you have to treat it as such. Every inverter manufacturer is different, every model produced, even some within the same model had differences in firmware and responsiveness, and the situation they find themselves in is also different. So you have to be very detailed in your analysis on exactly what happened, and then from there, the solutions become a lot more manageable to addressing the actual root causes identified.
And I'll make a plug for internal controls here. I mean, I think, make sure change management, that when you change one thing, you're not messing up your coordination of your settings.
Yeah, robust management of change process is necessary to make sure that you're still in compliance with your PRC curves, making sure that you're coordinating between your substation settings, because the last thing you need is for your substation to take you out. Your inverters can go all day, but the substation takes you out, and what's the point of even trying then? And just also management of change of any configuration changes across your fleet. If I make a change here, one of the steps of any robust management of change process is validating where the replication needs to go and making sure that you're tracking through whatever your asset management system you're using, it's being done in the appropriate way. And then you also need some control to go back and make sure that changes aren't being done unintendedly or unapproved, so that you have some way of monitoring your configuration over time.
The other factor is NPS CAD models, there's a lot of different settings in these things. It's not just a flat model. There are different things for different pieces. Does that match up with the real world? Then separately, is the real world that you're modeling match what actually occurred in the real event? I mean, most of the models we got as planners, all of our lines are in service. But in the real world, we know there's some outages going on every day. So the devil's in the details.
Yeah, there was some discussion of that right in the modeling
Yeah.
panel this morning. And then it also makes me think of the cybersecurity panel a little bit, like plan for your worst day, right? I think that was said multiple times before lunch. So thinking about that.
Now let's go ahead and go to the next one.
Okay, how do you enforce performance? That is, if they do not ride through, do you disconnect them?
I wonder who that's for.
So I guess that's me.
Yes,
So,
that's you, Scott.
yeah, thank you. Thank you for that question. Appreciate it. Anyways, good question. For us, we have an interconnection agreement that is a contract. If we work with you, we're going to form a breach letter. That breach letter is going to get filed. We're going to get a mitigation and a plan to fix that, and then it's going to go back. We do not disconnect. We all need resources, but that has to be filed, and there has to be a plan and a due date when it's going to be complete. And so that's how we handle it. We do not disconnect them, but we do, in instances, issue a breach letter, breach of contract, and that I believe is filed with FERC, and so Office of Enforcement, and then move down the path toward a corrective action.
And I think that's up for discussion right now at ERCOT in NOGR 248?
245.
245.
Yeah.
245.
By the way, speaking to that, there is a lot of megawatts involved. It isn't just a few thousand, it's significant. And at this time, we're counting on those resources. And looking at the latest interconnection queue, most of the interconnection queue is IBR resources.
Yeah.
I don't see a lot of dispatchable, except for maybe the batteries, but again, that's IBR. So it's kind of interesting right now. Do we really, we're trading one reliability problem for another reliability problem.
And this kind of harkens back to the statement that I made earlier about bringing all appropriate parties to the table. No, you don't want to disconnect generating resources, especially if, and on a high peak day, you don't want to do that. It's this time of year, you certainly want every generating resource available to be available. No, you definitely don't want to just take them out of the mix altogether, but you do have to have the right people in the room to come to an agreement. So much like Scott said, it's not just we're gonna hit you with a stick. It's we want to help you do better, and I think that has to be the approach.
Yeah, I will say, from an enforcement perspective, so much of what we do is focused on mitigation. What's going to prevent reoccurrence?
Yeah.
ERO-wide, that's a real emphasis for us. So, okay, next question. Prescriptive solutions can only work if based on accurate, comprehensive current data. How do you ensure that that is the case? Do you want to answer this, Joe?
No idea.
No, you don't.
I
It's a
got
great question, whoever had it.
Yeah.
Okay, so What I'll tell you
Yeah.
is a lot of thought into this because we go to events and they don't respond as you're expecting to be in the model. And so the question becomes, how do you validate what's going on out there? And so when we bring new resources on, everybody has to put in their models based on mod 26 or maybe it's 27. And then they have a chance after they go into service, I think it's 12 months before they have to issue a final as-built. But we find that those aren't accurate. And so there is currently not some sort of validation for a site because you don't fault the site, right? You don't trip a line or something to see if it works. So how you get accurate, comprehensive data is unfortunately, when there's an event, you have to look at your model, then go back, and if it's not working, this is how it's done today. If there's a better way to do it or some way to validate those models that go in, we need it. Because today we see an event, if it doesn't work on a fault current level, on a planning, on a tripping level, we have to start our process where we have, why isn't it working? How do we get an accurate model? Now we have a baseline that you can give me a model that you think is accurate. Now I put it in this event, and I see if it performs like the actual data I now have. So that's how I would say we're getting current. There's no other way to know for me on the data that's submitted. We just assume that it was correct without some sort of field data.
Yeah, this might go to your conversation topic earlier of talent.
Yes.
You know, like you need some theoretical scientist here, you know, to.
We need
to-
some
yeah,
cloning, I think.
Yeah.
I think that's all of our questions. Great discussion, guys, and thank you very much for fielding a bunch of questions. Good job there as well. So give them a hand, everybody, please.
Give Mark one.
Just a couple of thoughts mostly. And of course, we've been dealing with this inverter issue since the Blue Cut fire in 2017. Guidelines have been piled upon guidelines. Reports have been piled on, probably as tall as you are, Ken, on the impacts of these IBRs and how they are reacting. And yet getting industry action, I'll say industry as a broad, has been slow.
Yes.
And that's why keeping the conversation going results in the thought of standards and ensuring that generators that are coming on the system realize that they're not there just to generate megawatts, but to also sustain the bulk power system. It's kind of one of their responsibilities to interconnect with the system. So I've really appreciated the work that we've had here with ERCOT. And I hope that we continue to bring that forward to the rest of the industry around North America, because what I hear there is, that's not my problem. Not yet. I don't have to worry
Not
about
yet,
that yet.
yeah.
Yeah, and so we need to, if we can set the stage here, think of how many blackouts we will prevent. And we'll never get credit for it. Nobody will call you at 3 o'clock in the morning, Ken, and said it worked. But it will work. And so I think it's really important that we motivate industry, get the right people to the workshops and to the standard drafting teams, and those that want to prevent motion, to get them a bit out of the way so we can enact motion and be performance-based, of course, not we're going to be totally prescriptive. Now, I have heard this issue around wind and IBR with solar, and that's come back to me. And then the grandfathering versus the non-grandfathering and all that. I'm not going to tell ERCOT how to do their business. You guys can sort that out. But you know, I am pleased that of the actions that in Texas we've been taking in the partnership with TRE and ERCOT, and we're looking forward to their support as we move some of these standards through the process. So thank you.
Thanks, Mark. And with that, we'll take a break before we get our last panel going of the day. So we'll be back at 2:20, please. 2:20.
You guys are great. Good job. Celebrities.
Thank you.
What a
Thank you
celebrity.
very much.
Yeah, well, that's your spot, so we kind of need to get y'all start to sit down. He's right over there reading.
Yeah, those are extra water.
Well, I'm not sure if, Jay will want. Yeah, me too. I think we priced it out. Yeah, it was cool. Yeah, I was talking to her. How you doing?
Okay, everybody, we're at 2:20, so it's time to get going with today's last panel. The next panel will be Meeting Inverter-Based Resources Performance Challenges, and we are pleased to have Carol Liu from AEP, Chase Smith from Southern Company, Jay Texera from ERCOT, Michael Jacobs from Orsted, and this panel will be moderated by Abby Fellinger from Texas RE. It's all you, Abby.
Thank you, Matt, I appreciate it.
So, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Today we're going to discuss the challenges related to the changing and growing resource mix during the interconnection process in the ERCOT region. So our panel today, I know we briefly went over it, but just to kind of go over again, Jay Texera is going to talk about the ERCOT interconnection process, and then Carol Liu with AP is here to provide insight from a transmission perspective. And we also have Michael Jacobs with Orsted and Chase Smith with Southern Power Company, and they're going to talk about the interconnection process from a generation standpoint. So today I'd like to start off with Jay, if you don't mind kind of going over the interconnection process from an ERCOT standpoint.
Okay. So, and is the slide going to go up?
Yeah, it should show up here
Okay.
in just a second.
All right, so viewing the slide that just went up, we'll start on the far left. This is the timeline for the interconnection process. This is for large generators, and it's the longest timeline. There are a couple other entry points into this timeline, but we'll start with the large one first, go all the way through it, then I'll show you where the other entry points are. So this timeline is 24 to 30 months. And you see over on the left, it has a number of assumptions. The IE has to submit correct data. It has to meet all the milestones on time. Very important, it does not change equipment. And the TSP has no backlog. And so a lot of that, I think the TSP usually has a backlog these days because they're very busy. So we start on the far left, the date January 1, 2020. That's when they submit the request. We call it an application. This automatically kicks off a screening study by ERCOT. ERCOT has 3 months to do that screening study. So at the end of 3 months, the IE, the interconnecting entity, this is the developer, they'll get that screening study. And once they get that screening study, they have 6 months to decide to move forward. And moving forward means to initiate the full interconnect study with the TSP. So that happens on 10/1/2020. The FIS starts, and then the TSP does a number of things, some agreements, and some meetings. Most importantly, they do the steady state study, the short circuit study, dynamic study, and the facility study. That timeline that it takes them to do that varies. I have on the slide, I gave them 10 months. It can range from 9 to 13. It may even be shorter than that, depending on how busy they are. So at the end of the FIS, the full interconnect study, they may have to do a subsynchronous resonance study. That's the SSR. They'll have to do this if they're N minus 14 contingencies away from being in series with a series capacitor. And they know they'll have to do this study way back when we give them the screen study results. So if they have to do the SSR, then they do the SSR. They usually do that with a TSP or somebody the TSP contracts with. So then the next major milestone after the FIS is the QSA. This is the quarterly stability analysis. This starts on 11/1/2021 on this timeline. So the QSA is dependent upon when they want to synchronize, when they want to start generating. So if you look to the right on the timeline, at May 1st, 2022, Part 2 approval, that's when they desire to synchronize. So for May 2022, the QSA, they'll have to be in this about 6 to 8 months prior. So that gives a deadline of 11/1 for the QSA. So if they wanted to synchronize in July, then the deadline would be February 1. But since they picked May, the deadline is November 1. And so there's a number of prerequisites they have to do in order to be ready for the QSA. One, the FIS has to be done. Two, the reactive study has to be done, which I have on 1/8/2021. And number three, Planning Guide 6.9 has to be met, which means they have to do the standard generation interconnection agreement, notice to proceed, and the financial commitment. That's in green, 8/1 to 11/1. And they also have to submit enough data to get into the planning models. So once they do all that stuff, they do it before 11/1, they get into the QSA. The QSA is a stability analysis of all the generators that are going to synchronize in that quarter. We put them all in the same case, see what problems there are. And depending on if there's any problems, we may have to create a generic transmission constraint, a GTC. Once they get out of the QSA, then they have to, well, in order to synchronize in May, they have to submit their model data for the operations model. They have to submit that 90 to 120 days before they can go into the model. So the PLD, that's production load date. That's when they go into the network operations model. That's when they're built, and that's when the ERCOT systems first see them. So once that occurs, they can start connecting their equipment to the grid. We call this energization, part 1 approval. And then part 2, they can start connecting their generator. They can start generating. If they're a battery, they can start charging as well. Now, once they get part 2 and they start generating, there's a number of tests they have to do. AVR test, a BSS test, reactive test, maybe a curtailment test if they're an IRR. Once they've successfully completed all those tests, then they do part 3, which is approval, well, it's commercial operations date. They're commissioned, and they're out of the interconnection process. So that whole thing takes 24 to 30 months. Now, there are some other starting points, and they can come in instead of just requesting the screening study, they can come in and request screening study and the full interconnect study at the same time. So this is cut off 9 months. And then everything else is the same moving after the full interconnect study. If they're a small generator, which means they're less than 10 megawatts, whether they're connected to transmission or distribution, they have some meetings, the TSP does some whatever studies it wants to do, and then it comes in right at the point where they have to submit their resource data and then get into the model. Then they do the part 1, part 2, part 3. So that's the entire process. ERCOT's a little different from some of the other entities outside ERCOT, where we don't really have a queue. Everybody comes in, like I said, you can start on the far left, or you can start with the FIS, so you can immediately jump a lot of people. So it's not a queue. And they pretty much go at their own rate. You know, if they can't meet the QSA, well, then they meet the next QSA or the next QSA. So they go at their own rate. Some of them fall into a status what we call inactive, when they just haven't done anything in a while, don't think they're going to do something in a while, so they go inactive. That way we stop bugging them. And so that's the interconnection process.
Thanks so much for that, Jay. That's very helpful, especially to see the visual stages. Between part 2 and part 3, is there like a certain fuel type, if you will, that seems to get stuck in that category, or it just varies, or?
A certain fuel type. I'm not sure you can narrow it down by fuel type. I mean, most of what we have coming in
Renewable.
are solar and battery, and then they're getting stuck. And then we still have some wind. So it kind of cycled. A few years ago, wind was number 1 coming in, and then solar, and now battery's number 1. And we've had some that have been in that part 2 phase for almost 2 years, and we don't want them there.
Right.
So we have a planning guide revision request to try to set a time limit, 300 days, for them to get from part 2 to commissioning. But as a fuel type, I don't think it's really varies by fuel type.
Sure.
It's equipment problems. A lot of times they get equipment problems, they have problems testing. They can't pass the tests, stuff like that.
Thank you so much for that. And you did make many references to TSPs, transmission service providers, and so now I want to turn it over to Carol, if you could kind of define your role as a TSP.
Sure. My team does system performance analysis, mainly focus on the dynamic part, because Jay mentioned, there's steady state part and dynamic. So my team mainly focus on dynamic part. That's what I'm going to speak to. As also he mentioned in ERCOT, because we have serious caps in ERCOT, right? So we have 2 types of studies. One is just, we call that, stability study. The other one is SSR study, subsynchronous resonance study. So for each of these 2 studies, there's 2 parts, just because, the model complexity and whatnot. So for example, in stability, we first do it, we call it a VRT study, voltage right-through, but it's not really a true right-through, right? In terms of the field performance. It's a model validation type of test for voltage regulation. So does the generator model respond to the system voltages, right? Does it respond correctly? So that's a VRT test we do. We use the single model. We connect it to a controllable infinite bus. So that's kind of a first step screening. Then after that, if we pass that part, then we say, okay, the model is usable, right? Then we move on to the stability part, which we run the contingencies, defined in the TPL 001, P1 to P7 contingencies. Then that's where we plug in the proposed project with nearby generation, in a bigger system. So that's stability. Then for subsynchronous resonance, it's the same process. So first we do a frequency scan in PSCAD just to, see issues in general. Then depending on the results of that, if we pass the first step, right, then we plug in with proposed project, again with nearby generations for the detailed, time domain PSCAD study. So those are just basically, the 2 main dynamic study we do that my team provide assistance.
Great, thank you, Carol. So now I want to turn it over to Chase, Michael. I'll let y'all decide who's going first. But will you provide a little insight on the interconnection process from a generator standpoint, and maybe talk a little bit about how ERCOT's process compares to the other areas in the country?
Yeah, I'm happy to start, and then you can clean up anything I miss. So, I think from a generator perspective, I think I'd like to start even just like very big picture. There's many factors that a generation owner is evaluating and considering when thinking about developing and acquisition opportunities. One of them is an interconnection, but also, what's expected market and contractual revenues, where is it being connected to the system, is there available transmission transfer capability, what's the operational capability of the equipment we're buying and or developing, to the previous conversation on the last panel. And also just like the overall regulatory political environment. I think specifically for interconnection, I think we want to understand what's the expected timeline, what's the expected process to go through that timeline and the obligations we have to meet, and then also what are potential risks to delays in time and also cost uncertainty about potential upgrades that we may trigger, based on the impact of our interconnecting resource into the part of the system we're connecting to. I think when I'm thinking specifically about ERCOT's process, Jay has laid out here in detail. So, a generation owner needs to understand what this looks like, both on the interconnection side and then on the second part, which is the commissioning, which I think we're going to get into even further detail further into this panel about what are all the obligations I need to go through in the three-part commissioning phase process that ERCOT has. I think big picture differences between what ERCOT's interconnection process looks like compared to other planning regions in the country. There are a few ones that jump out to me. I think first off is ERCOT uses a serial process to take in interconnection requests and study, compared to lots of other regions use a cluster process where there is a defined window where I have to submit an interconnection request into, and I'm studied along other similar generators with electrical impact. And so we've seen in some of those processes in the country significant delays and timing that is required to study and evaluate that cluster. I think ERCOT's done a really good job avoiding that and keeping a reasonable timeline to go through this process, which it helps and brings certainty when generation owners are evaluating making significant capital investment decisions. And I think part of what's caused some of the delays in these other regions is this next point, is that there are some areas where significant network upgrades and costs can be assigned to interconnecting customers. And it is our experience, we've seen that sometimes that can significantly change the expected economics of a project, where you may have interconnection projects withdrawing, and then there's a smaller pool of resources that have to pay for the overall upgrade costs, and it triggers restudies if you have too many drop out, and that can just cause delays and overall uncertainty about what are the costs it's going to take for me to interconnect my project. I think the final item I would say, and this is kind of along the same vein, but affected system studies in certain regions can also significantly contribute to uncertainty in timing and potentially triggering upgrades in other affected systems that are, our project may be near. So yeah, that's I think covers all the items I wanted to touch on.
Well, in addition to those things that you say, I think the one thing that's particular when it comes to ERCOT is the process is unique in the fact that they are really truly focusing on reliability in their process. They are wanting to make sure that generators are actually able to hit their marks before they become an operational site, which is a great thing because it helps us from a compliance portion and from a reliability portion. Because if we're getting a site that's been through the Part 3 process and Part 2 and Part 1, and we know that site can meet all the marks that AEP is looking for and what ERCOT is looking for, then more than likely that site's going to be a real reliable, efficient site when it comes online and start operating. So that's one of the things that I really appreciate. And in some other areas, there's not that testing rigor that ERCOT has to make sure, or even the TSPs to make sure that these things are met, because ERCOT has that standard that they have set, that we have to make sure these things are met. We can't just, go in the cluster and then we find out later that maybe some of these people don't want to be in, some people want to be out. We're able to kind of control our own stuff because we're alone in that process. And if we decide in that process we want to delay it, like you stated, we have an opportunity, or if we move forward. So I think that's an interesting point for ERCOT in a positive manner. That's good. The other thing is that some of those tests, you didn't speak about a few of them. You spoke about a few of them where you have primary frequency response, you have voltage ride through. These things are things that we deal with once we become operation, and we need to make sure that these things are met. Sometimes in other regions, you only, I think the guy from CAISO spoke of it, they don't get them until they happen. Well, we at least get sometimes to have a little testing of it at the beginning. So that's another thing that, you get a benefit from it. So to me, and it's a thing that we like to say in Ørsted, is that, compliance is usually the last thing that fails. Reliability fails first. And when reliability fails, then it results in a compliance failure. So we want to eliminate that situation, and ERCOT puts us in a great situation to not have that happen.
That's a great summary. Thank you so much for that, Michael. Carol, I'd like to go back to you, if you will. Can you share a little information about any model or other data challenges that you've experienced from the transmission side, and maybe how you validate the process, how the validation process works?
Okay, sure. I think as we talk a lot about models, right? So we get the models, of course. So the first thing we notice is sometimes there's insufficient data, like transformer information is missing or something missing in the model itself. So we talk to developers and address those. So that's the first part, right? And it happens a lot. And also there's different versions of PSSE. There's different versions of PSCAD. Sometimes we get it, we run, but there's some incompatibility problems. So those are like small issues, but it does take a long time. Usually, let's say it could take up to 5 months, 8 months, to solve those issues. So once those issues are solved, meaning that the model is okay to run, right? We can plug it in the system and click run, and then it doesn't, crap out on us. So that once we can do that, then there's performance issues. Does it really write through multi-regulation, right? Does it really meet the criteria? Does the results look good? So that's the second part. Then for SSO, it's like, do you have SSO issues? And then after you change, then we go back to developer, right? After they change the model, does the performance improve? Is there what mitigation they can do? And so it's a back and forth issue. Again, I think the second part, right, is the process validation. So that part, I would say as TSP, we get what we get. So there's I would say maybe a disconnect or maybe a gap, right? We study the model passed, but it's not a field test. So what's installed in the field versus the field performance, right? It's not one-to-one ratio, because we do see events. I think somebody mentioned earlier that a study results can look good, but if you have an event or fault on the system in real life, you can still find write-through issues. Then what happens, right? There's a lot of investigation on recent events, particularly also we know cases in ERCOT. So we have to go back and figure out, okay, which part we missed, right? So it's not guarantee of field performance, but as TSP, that's all the information we have. So we do run those tests. And again, like for the stability study, it's just the stability, right? You run contingencies, you see if there's system issues, but it's not a write-through. So the true write-through, it's not there today, I would say. So that's, still efforts needs to be done, I would say, down the road.
And Jay, do you have anything you want to add as far as any concerns from a data standpoint, modeling?
Well, getting data, we get data from the owners of the equipment. That's the TSPs and the resource entities. TSPs are the only ones that can really access our model and directly put that data into the model. The resource entities, they've got a little bit of a different path that they have to go through. If anyone's heard of the RARF, Resource Asset Registration Form, we use that basically since Node will go live. And it's a set of 3 workbooks, Excel workbooks. There's one for general and easy site ID, one for the old transmission equipment, and another one that varies based on your technology. So there's a workbook for conventional generation, wind generation, and solar called renewable, combined cycle, and I think that's it. If I've got one, let me know. But anyhow, those forms, they're very rigid. And over the years, we started off with, well, we think we need this kind of data. Then we find out, oh, we need to add this kind of data. And maybe we don't need that kind of data. So in order to add that to the RAR forms, we had to send out the RAR forms with all the new fields to everybody, every resource entity, have them refill it out and resend it in so that it all synced. And so we thought, okay, if we get rid of the RAR, if we go to something that's a little more flexible, like anyone's heard of RIO, Resource Integration and Ongoing Operations. It's a set of web pages where you can do the interconnection process, you can submit data, you can attach documents, and then for anybody with an existing generation, you can get in and submit change requests. So we thought, okay, if we go to that, that will make adding new fields a lot easier because, well, you'll just see your data and there'll be 3 blank fields. You just fill out those 3 blank fields. Everything is, everything else has to stay the same. And that'll happen someday. But Rio is still kind of in construction. We got a lot of changes to go to it. I mean, it's been in production since, 2018, when we started the interconnection services and doing the interconnection stuff through it. Then the next year, they started doing the change requests where you can change existing data. And this year, we've got to, in the interconnection side, you will use the RARF, you'll enter your data in the web pages. But we still have to go ESRs. The ESR is going to have its own set of web pages. And that highlights still the inflexibility because right now the ESRs, the batteries, are using conventional generation forms, which is a very bad fit. There's a lot of battery data we don't have there, and there's a lot of conventional data that we need to get out of there for the batteries. So batteries, by the end of this year, will hopefully have its own set of web pages. That solves one problem. And then we have a whole bunch of revision requests we have to do, get that in Rio. And that's going to keep us busy through the end of the year and probably into next. But one of these days, we'll finish it, and we'll get to that utopia where we add new fields, it'll be really easy. But, the quality of the data has been a problem, but also just collecting the data has been a problem, and it's been a constant struggle to collect the data. Now, we have a lot of help information on our resource integration website. If you go to ERCOT.com, you go to services and resource integration, there's a bunch of help there, especially for signing up on Rio. For TSPs, make sure you read the document, because a lot of TSP members are signing up wrong, and they're getting access as an interconnecting entity, which doesn't do them any good. And there's a lot of work we got to do on the back end to change that. So make sure you read the information on the resource integration site. We have a handbook out there, which we try to put in plain English, not the nodal, not the operating guide, not the planning guide type language, but plain English, kind of the same information that will further help you. So that should really help you. The handbook should really help.
Thank you, Jay. Thanks for sharing those resources. Now I kind of want to go back to the generation side, and Chase, if you could kind of explain if you've seen any model challenges on your side of the fence.
Yeah, and the answer is yes. And I think obviously models have been a huge part of the conversation today, right? And for a good reason. I mean, they're very important, and we need to be striving to improve the quality, the timeliness of these models so we can better understand the expected performance and continue to validate them and compare them to what's happening in the field. I'm also going to list a couple things that I would say, from my perspective, we've seen as challenges trying to get to that point, right? Some of the issues we have faced trying to get accurate and models submitted timely and to support all of the planning and analysis that ERCOT and TSPs need to do. I think the underlying issue is just that they're very technically complex and there's limited, scarce engineering resources to develop, validate, and study them. And I think from my experience, it takes significant time to go to the original equipment manufacturers for them to develop a model. They are really the expert of their equipment, and the GOs have little to no leverage to push them for providing a thorough and response by a certain timeline, and they kind of depends on their bandwidth and what they're able to support at that given time. That may take 6 to 8 months. I'm speaking generally, but to develop a model to get to us, we usually like to review it. Have our own SMEs review that, do some validation. Part of a problem here is the models are typically black box in nature, and that it prevents us from, I would say, the GO from fully being able to dig into and understand and vet or tweak anything in the model. And so, then we submit it to ERCOT or TSP, and that takes significant time to review. Sometimes deficiencies are identified. We have to go back and re-engage with the OEM. And we do so, but it just, all of a sudden, we might be talking 12 to 15 months, and the main person on our team leading the effort may have switched roles. So there's some, it takes time, and having the right people and knowledge to be able to support the overall process, and there's different, I think, subject matter expertise that's needed to support that. So that's one thing. I think specifically for IBRs, we've been talking about models versus what's been happening in some of these ride-through events. Current IBR modeling practices are an aggregation, and it's a representation of a whole site, and it's kind of modeled as one generator when in fact it's made up of many separate inverters. And because of that disconnect, it is hard for us to get a model that will fully capture the possible responses of individual inverters across the site, across the wide spectrum of possible operating conditions. I think we have experienced at some of our facilities before, inverter 1 on one side of the site experienced conditions quite different at its inverter terminals than the inverter 2 at the other side of the site. And so that gets both into being able to guarantee and make sure that the whole site is performing in a way to meet these performance standards, but also how are we supposed to model that? So I think part of it is there's more work that needs to be done to, can we get more granular? Is there better ways to do the modeling we're doing currently? But that has been a challenge for us at times, and that kind of leads also into, we've had sometimes the actual performance doesn't behave the way the model says. And so then, there's further tuning and review of, well, why is that? Did we have something set wrong in the field? Is it a limitation of the model? Do we need to update the model to just reflect that, maybe the design has said it could do one thing, but actual performance has dictated maybe something different? So that further takes time and effort and a lot of smart people working on. I think this is a very unique situation, but we have had instances where we have OEMs who are no longer in business. So we're asked to provide an updated model, and it becomes quite difficult to do so. So we've had to engage with a separate OEM, and we're still working through that, but that is another challenge that has happened over time with us. I guess my last point I would kind of conclude with is, we fully support trying to improve modeling efforts and getting the best, most accurate models we can. And as a GO, we want to support doing so because we recognize the importance of how that will contribute to reliability on the system. And so just the further we can get to standardized industry-wide accepted models will, I think, be beneficial for the whole industry so that we're not, from a GO perspective who is doing things in CAISO and ERCOT and all playing regions across the country, we're not having to meet very different modeling standards in different parts, wherever our project is. So.
Thank you. And Michael, do you have anything you want to?
Yeah, excuse me. To add on to that, I think one of the biggest things that we see is when you do tune the site and you do the testing is the information transfer. Because even though we tested the site, we confirmed the site, now we have to take that data and we need it for other things. We may need it for to give to ERCOT and give to the TSP, or we may need it to use that data from the testing to now create a Mod 26 or Mod 27 report, or be able to create a Mod 26 or 27 report. So there's a lot of things that go around the modeling that could be misconceptions from a conventional generation to a renewable generation because of what you just said. You have multiple generators that we're aggregating to one generator, and we're trying to make this one model be a summation of a aggregation, and that's a difficult scenario because each one of these generators are designed to operate one way, but when they aggregate it, then they're in a aggregation state, and they're trying to get to one point of interconnection, and now we're trying to fixate that model for that aggregation, and that's a scenario that you could test, And just like a regular conventional generation, you get one result, and then 5-10 years later, you may get a different result. But the thing is that we're trying our best to do what's best and help the grid and give good data. And I agree with you. If there was a standardized way that they wanted the models to be presented, I think it'll help, because when you're in different locations, you may have a version 33 over here, PSSE, you may have a version 34. Someone else may say, well, I want version 31, and you're like, nobody even use that anymore. But that's the scenario that we have to deal with. So, we have to be flexible, because we're in the market that they're in, and we want to make sure we provide good data and be a good steward to the grid.
I appreciate all those perspectives, and yes, entities, I respect all the different regions that you have to kind of accommodate, if you will. So thank you for those points. Jay, Carol, how does it impact the process if generators change their equipment, which Chase kind of talked about, after the interconnection studies have been completed? And are there ways to kind of minimize that impact?
You want to go first, or?
Sure. I think, so the model change does happen, right? So I think the first thing we need to understand is, if your model changed, then we have to restudy everything. So that's part one, part two. And then that it's, we have to just treat it as a new project, right? Because there's model changes, we don't know what changes. So we can't use any prior knowledge of prior study. So basically we treat it as a new study. And then I think the more important part is, to do a restudy, you need time, because that part sometimes isn't understood well, because we get yelled at and say, hey, we made change, why it takes so long? But it's essentially a new study and take a long time to study, because we go back to the original, right? So we would appreciate to allow us more time, because I think when that happens, usually we are under the impression that you can do it faster, but not really, right? Because we still have 10, 20 other projects in the queue. It just, we are also resource limited. Good engineers, they leave, and then we train them again, and then it's work is more, engineer is less these days. So it's one of our struggles for sure.
Yeah, I have to agree. I mean, we're getting that more and more, where there's problems. There's supply chain problems, and so we try to deal with it. Two gentlemen over to my left and right were both talking about aggregation. You can make it easy. You can model each individual inverter as a generator. I mean, but we kind of thought that the resource entities didn't want that. So I think we can do anything along that whole spectrum there. But reaggregation, if they can't get the turbines or the inverters that they thought they were going to be able to get, and we had already aggregated into a resource, and there's a set of tests in the protocols that you have to run to say, well, can this inverter be aggregated with this inverter? And if it can't, then it has to be a whole new resource. And there's a whole new resource, and that means you got to do all that stuff for that new resource that you hadn't already done. Sometimes the FISs don't need to be restudied. It all depends on what changes, but a lot of the times it's going to be a change of equipment that changes the dynamic model. FIS studies will need to be redone. Commissioning, if you've done any commissioning testing, or if you had like 100 turbines, and you can get like 80 of them right now, you get 20 next year sometime, well then you can't do the commissioning testing, the part 2 testing, AVR, VSS, reactive, and the PFR I talked about earlier. You have to have all your equipment there. So what we can do is you can split that INR into an INR with the 80 that you have now, and then make another one for that 20 you'll get next year, and then we can commission the 80 you have now. So we're trying to come up with ways to work around that. And I think that's all I had, but yeah.
Thanks for that, Jay. Appreciate that. So now I want to go back to Chase and Michael. I know there was a conversation during the IBR panel a little bit about required field tests. Can you describe any issues you've seen performing the field test during the interconnection process? You want to take that?
You start.
Okay. Well, I think it goes back to something that we just was talking about. There's 3 phases in the commissioning process for a generator that's an IBR. We have the O&M commissioning, where the O&M manufacturers is commissioning their equipment. So it could be a wind turbine, it could be an inverter, it could be a main power transformer, wherever that is. We have to go through that phase first. And then we move from that phase to doing a system integration internal of the site, where we're now combining these generators and that transformer that they tested separate and a breaker now to get those together. And then you have the third phase where we then get you guys involved, where we're now trying to take that equipment and now test it to make sure we get into those models and those verifying those studies that we said we can meet. So for us, the one thing that we've seen is that you can have a problem at each one of those stages and it delays something. You could have a transformer that tested well, a main power transformer, tested well everywhere around, and then when it comes time for to hook that transformer up to the generators, the transformer craps out. Well, now we're in a process where we're close to getting through part 2, and we're like, well, we can't move. We got to go get a new transformer. So those things exist, and that's a situation where we have to be ready for and be prepared. And these are things that you can't account for. So sometimes the issue is just, equipment failures and equipment dynamics that could come about. The other thing that is out there is that the resources that we're using for the O&M manufacturers, when they do come out and do testing, we find something that's not right. Well, we're commissioning a site here, but there could be 10 to 15 more sites being tested at the same time and verified. Well, we're pulling off the same resources from that O&M manufacturer if we all using the same O&M manufacturers, because there are not 100 of them, there's probably 6 or 7. So we're all pulling off those same manufacturers to get that engineer over there to come look at something and fix it. And that engineer may be time constrained, maybe a resource that's limited. So, these are 2 things that for sure that come to mind. And a third thing could be, and you spoke of it earlier, the turbine types and controllers. Sometimes we have to get 2 different types of turbines and 2 different controllers that we had to have at a site that we are using to connect to the grid because of the limitations of what we had at the time. We had this amount of turbines over here and these amount of turbines over there. But when we go to test those turbines, we have to test one static and one dynamic, because we want to see how that turbine acts so that you guys get a good representation of how our site would work for us modeling and testing and verifying all those things that we talked about earlier. And we are always trying to be prepared for the inevitable that something's going to go wrong. And when I say something's going to go wrong, it's not going to be catastrophic. It may be something where we lose a fuse or we lose something that now we have to get back from an O&M manufacturer, something like that. So these are things that we have to be prepared for. And we have to also be able to communicate that to the TSP and ERCOT, because they're looking for us to be basically as a operating resource, not just a commissioning resource. They want to know, hey, we're not able to get this point today because we got this going on. Okay, that's fine. So we have to be in constant contact. We have to be aware of it and make sure that we're doing our best to be a reliable entity. And again, you're trying to be a good stewards, and we're trying to do the right thing. So those are some of the things that we've, I see that I've seen in my past and seen here at Ørsted, that these are things that we have to be prepared for, and every generator has to be aware of.
So I would say Southern Power has had success and challenges for different projects going through the commissioning process, in a timely fashion. And I think part of it, just like anything in life, it's you learn by doing. So there's some learning curve if you are a new generation owner going through the ERCOT process for the first time and understanding what's really required in the commissioning tests and the process of completing them and submitting the information to ERCOT, coordinating with the TSPs when you're doing the tests. From my experience, I think generally we haven't had as many challenges, and it's been easier to complete the frequency response tests, the AVR tests. It's been more so on the reactive power tests. I'd be curious to hear if you have, from your perspective, seen certain subset of tests within that Part 3 testing that has been more difficult than others. But I think I can't remember all. I know some of the tests require certain equipment available to be online. So if you have equipment off or derates, or we're talking about a project that's been built and going through commissioning process still, we may have had supply chain stuff or it's just not working exactly as we expected at first, where we've had times where we want to do the testing, but we don't have all the equipment online enough to be able to complete and pass the test under ERCOT's rules. So there's some that that has caused significant delays. For some of the tests, specifically for intermittent renewable resources, there's a defined energy production threshold that's expected and required in, I think, the reactive power tests. Where we'll schedule a test for the next day. It looks like there's going to be healthy wind, and then the wind doesn't show up, and we have to cancel it, and we have to reschedule. And getting the right, all the right people in the room who need to, be on that to support that, coordinating with the TSP and so forth. I think one last thing I would say is there's I've seen maybe like a unique condition where sometimes the local system conditions where we're interconnected to like voltage may be running low, for example, and we're not able to fully demonstrate our reactive power capability just because the system can't take it, and that has required a little bit more coordination with ERCOT and the applicable TSP to put an appropriate testing plan together to be able to do so. So we basically had gone out and done a test. Could inject more VARs, but we're told not to, and then kind of had to do some more coordination to make sure we were putting a testing plan together that fit and met what the TSP and ERCOT wanted to see. So yeah, that's I think Jay referenced it, and a recent planning guide revision request that is now going to put a timeline in the ERCOT process that interconnecting commissioning projects need to, once they sync to the grid, they have 300 days to be able to do these requirements, and I think that's a good change to put teeth into it and give ERCOT a way to enforce if we have projects that are lingering for too long, to put incentive out there and push them along.
Thank you, Chase. I appreciate that. And you were touching on supply chain issues, so I kind of want to go back to Michael here and just get your opinion. Is there a better way we could work through some of the supply chain or resource issues that may impact projects?
I think, like I stated not long ago with the last question, is we got limited resources from the OEMs that we're trying to pull from for sometimes for information requests, a NERC alert or whatever it is. If it comes brought out from NERC and everybody has to answer, I have to answer the same question Chase do, and Chase has to go to the same O&M manufacturers we have to go to. They're getting the same response. I think the one thing is that we can do there is maybe do more of a group think approach where instead of us getting individual responses, and that's with the O&M manufacturers, where they're able to give more of a collective response for us, so that way we won't end up harassing them in a way and asking all the same questions at the same time. We're able to get one response that is able to be a sweeping response. But when I say that, I also understand that there are dynamics where each individual site and each location operate different. So they may be able to give us a response at the turbine level, but not so much at the collective aggregate level. So there are some things that we need to work out. I will say that there is some light at the end of the tunnel because we are doing more communications and conversations about some of the things that's going on out there for renewables. There are working groups out there where people are talking and getting together and talking about some things, and we're trying to move the ball forward. So I wouldn't say that we're completely way at the first end, at the beginning of the tunnel, but we're somewhere in the middle trying to get out. We just, I think, I can't remember the guy name who spoke earlier from OWL, but as he said, each generation type has went through this. It's an evolution. So at the beginning, there was a lot of figuring out, trying to get there, and then, you eventually you broke through and got through that tunnel and got to the end. Simple cycle generators and combined cycle generators. I think when I was involved with them 10, 15 years ago, they had a problem with meeting primary frequency response in ERCOT. Well, we have some issues in IBRs, but from what I seen when I was on that side, I think it's either equivalent or they probably had it a little bit tougher, you know, to make it. So, you know, it's just one of those things where, you know, we're doing the right things. I don't think any IBR out there wants to have ERCOT call them and say, you keep messing up. We want to do the right things. We're moving in the right directions. We're pushing the OEMs hard to help us out. Not only are we pushing the OEMs hard, but we also have these compliance group, these working groups out there that the invertebrate resources are getting together and talking about these things and trying to find solutions, whether it's APA or, you know, the OOE. We're trying to move the ball. So there's improvements going on. And I think we're getting to a place where some change is going to come. It's just going to take some time. And, you know, what we get today won't probably fix all the old turbines, but it's going to fix the next evolution of turbines or the next evolution of the inverters. And that's what we got to do. Try to keep moving that target in a way that it's attainable and also it's reliable. We don't want to move the target to a place where we can't even reach it, and it's more difficult for the TSPs and ERCOT to help, you know, model the system and be able to count on us. We want them to be able to count on us.
Thank you for that. Thank you for pointing out outreach and collaboration and how important that is. So I want to go back to Carol, if you don't mind, and to what extent have you seen supply chain issues for required substation and transmission components affecting your construction of interconnection?
Yeah, sure. I have to borrow some of the answers from our project management team because my team just do the study. And so, yeah, there's a few points that they shared. So first is if there's a delay in material, right, that delays the in-service date of the project. Of course, let's say you have a customer and then they want to connect and start generating or start, you know, working their facility, but then there's a delay, so they can't get online. So that's an issue for our customer. Second thing is, you know, you have this material cost increase sometimes, right? If you have a delay, then the cost, you know, increase. Like even our docking station, we're going back to office. Docking station used to be 200, now it's 500 because they don't have enough around. So things like that cause, you know, we have this customer security that they have to do amendment because, you know, you sign a contract and the cost increase, the project cost will increase with the material cost, right? And then the third thing is PM usually deal with last minute delivery delay of certain material. Then they have to scramble to find replacement. And I think this happen pretty often. And it depends on like how robust you have, you know, redundancy program in your company, then that could be an issue, right? Depending on how long of a delay you have. And then the last thing, I think on the customer side, they could have a last minute change or delay. So that influence our in-service date. I happen actually to work with the PM for a few years, and then that's a big deal because we're looking at whole company portfolio. Right now it's probably $5-6 billion portfolio, right? So each month there are certain projects going in service, and then we are all pretty, I'll say they're pretty, you know, what word would be good? They're pretty, I think, you know, they want the in-service date to be right, so the dollar roll up to be right? Because we have, you know, stakeholders, and we do talk to Wall Street. There's earnings, and then, you know, if those are missed, then it could be a big impact. So.
Great, thank you. Everything comes back to money, doesn't it? So I'm going to start to my left, and then as anybody wants to talk to this. So as we're all aware, registration from a NERC standpoint is based on commercial operations date for generation units. So do you have any insight or any suggested activities that could be performed by, you know, the regions, ERCOT, NERC, to help entities just get ready early in the process? And I know we've kind of touched on this a little bit. But.
Yeah, I think we touched on a lot of it. I would say, you know, the NERC and the REs, I think if there's a real true focus on reliability, we need to probably look at the places where we're truly taking the time for as the commissioning process where reliability is checking out. ERCOT does a real good job with it, and the TSPs and the ERCOT, they make sure that the marks are hit, those boxes are checked. It's not just a formality. They want the data, they're confirming the data, they're making sure it's right. And I think that's a good thing. with that though, there comes some give and take. Of course, we don't want a new standard saying that we need to have a standard before compliance starts or registration starts. But I think there's a way to get around it, and by maybe doing some best practice guides of what ERCOT does, and maybe even what CAISO may be doing. I don't know all the details there, but what ERCOT and CAISO may be doing in their connection process, or interconnection process, that leans to a more reliable system, right? Because at the end of the day, that's what we all want. We want to go in the house and cut the lights on and make sure our air is on when it's hot outside. We want to make sure the heat comes on when it's cold outside. So to get there, we need to, one, have a focus on reliability for these generation sites when they come online, and be willing to understand that we're going to, have an issue or a problem that we all acknowledge up here, that those things happen, but it's what we do, how we learn from them. And at Orsted, we have a compliance assurance process where we look at what we've done in the past and how we connect the sites in ERCOT 3 or 4 years ago. We don't connect them like that anymore. We have better processes, we have better tools, and we try to modify that process every time we get a chance, and we try to replicate that in different places. So if we were to install a site in CAISO, we would probably use a lot of things that we did in ERCOT. And we, of course, want to listen to CAISO and do what they want. But if there's a place that don't have a standard, it's just like, hey, you signed up and you can connect, and we just need you to confirm it, we'll do the extra test, because we want to make sure that we're actually presenting a reliable site and we're being a steward to the grid. Like I said earlier, compliance don't fail first. It's usually the reliability side. So what we want to do is make sure that the reliability side is tight and everything's good. So if there's a reliability failure, that if it results in a compliance failure, we can prevent it and keep it from recurring the next time.
Thanks, Michael.
Okay, so from my side, I mentioned earlier that once the generators get Part 2, they've got to do a number of tests in order to be commissioned. I also mentioned that there's some that's been in this category for over 2 years. And you mentioned NERC doesn't help until they're commissioned. So we would like that some kind of NERC help in getting the projects that are in Part 2 for a long period of time, NERC help in getting them to move along. So that's all I got.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting concept, because there's this balance between, first day a project connects and energizes, are they fully ready, versus if you are lingering for a long, significant period of time. Right. There may make sense to kind of evaluate that further, but the first thing the thing that came to my mind was just trying to work on education and getting the right, training of folks internally within a generation owner to be prepared and ready for, once they've hit commissioning, they're ready to be a registered entity and comply with NERC standards. It's probably easier said than done. I don't have a silver bullet to offer on that, but I mean, perhaps just more resources and guidelines, from the Texas RE, for example, on, hey, if you're a new project interconnecting to the ERCOT system, what is going to be expected of you once you are fully commissioned. And I'm not sure how to get all of the new interconnecting projects to look through it and read it and digest it, but a thought, something to think about, and maybe there's some items potentially we can identify to just make sure that the information is out there and available. We can't force people to go look at it and see it, but it's not from it not being out there in the first place.
And I'd like to speak to that just a little bit. So I'm not sure if it's as robust as you're suggesting, but TexRE does have a new generator welcome packet that does address some of these items, and I think some of the other regions have kind of followed suit as well. But it does help from a standpoint for both GOs and GOPs to let them know what standards they're responsible for based on timelines, the effective registration day, or if it's an implementation plan. So there are some resources out there. That specific one you could get to from our TexRE website, and then either on the compliance tab or the registration. But I'm glad you opened
That's
that
good,
up.
that's good to know, because I did not know that, so like, you know, case in point.
I need to be a better communicator. All right, and then Carol, we're wrapping it up. Do you have anything that you'd like to
Well, I think
close
since you
with?
mentioned communication, I think that's important for, you know, working with TSPs, right? I think just keep that communication coming back and forth, because sometimes when we had the issue, we send an email, nothing happened for 5 months, and suddenly, oh, they come back, they want to connect, and then we have to scramble. So, you know, just keep that channel open and let's communicate, right? And then we can make it more efficient.
Right.
Great, thank you so much. I really appreciate everyone on the panel, and I have to apologize, I was trying to call you Michael Orsted earlier. So, are there any questions?
I think y'all are off the hook. No questions. Great job. Very interesting discussion. I appreciate y'all being here.
Thank you.
And with that, we can go into kind of the wrap-up phase of today's workshop. Just a couple things on our end. You will be getting your survey just after the conclusion of the workshop, so please do fill that out. It's meant to be just a few minutes, but we use the feedback to shape all of our future outreach, so please answer it honestly, and we do appreciate the time you take to do so. We do also have coming up a couple of other events. In August, we have our quarterly board meetings, and our guest keynote speaker that day will be ERCOT CEO Pablo Vegas. And then before that, on August 10th, we have Talk with Texas RE is finally coming back, and we had our 101, 201 series in June, and we had this workshop, but it's time for Talk with Texas RE to come back. For those of you that haven't attended one before, it's just our regular webinar series, usually half an hour to an hour long, on various grid reliability related topics, but this one will be on cybersecurity for DRs, which we've hit on a decent bit today. So with that, I think we are done for the day. Thank you, everybody, for being here.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.